Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the Mining Podcast. And today's guest is Matthew Laustrup, who is the sales manager for First Climate, who are a leading service provider of carbon emissions, supporting private and public sector organisations in achieving their climate and sustainable objectives. Matthew's here to talk about how he can help mining companies with their carbon and green energy agendas, as it's going to be a major part in their future strategies over the coming years. So now is the time to prepare if you're not already doing so. So that's welcome, Matt, to the podcast. How you doing, Matt?
Yeah, excited to be here. I've heard a few discussions of, well, maybe a month ago, mining participants talking about the carbon market. So I thought, as an expert here, I'd like to join and maybe provide a bit of insight.
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, you're a new listener to the podcast, and as you mentioned, we were speaking of, I can't remember what episode it was, but we were speaking about obviously carbon, and then obviously you approached me because you're an expert in this field. So I thought it'd be good to get you on to obviously explain to our audience within the mining industry more about carbon. So before we get into some of the questions I want to ask you, I wonder if you can just give us an overview of your background.
Sure. So I'm Canadian, actually, in Germany right now. I studied here in University of Munich. Background in carbon quantification. Master's thesis was in temperate landscapes and afforestation and carbon removals and carbon management in temperate landscapes. And then been working with First Climate in the carbon market for the past 3.5 years. The company is just over 20 years old. Clients in the energy sector, shipping, transportation, finance sector, helping them, with their net zero strategies. Also have developed a project or two with them as a way for their carbon portfolio and for them to be, carbon neutral and meet their net zero ambitions.
Yeah. Wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about the company, First Climate. Obviously, you said they've been going for 20 years. So I just wonder if you can give us, I suppose, a brief overview of that journey. I know you've only been there for 3.5 years, but just a little bit of background about the company and perhaps a little bit since you've been there.
Mm-hmm. Well, since I've been here, I guess one of the things that I think stands out for us is, well, the voluntary carbon market last year, just to kind of set the stage, was just over 100 million tons of carbon was retired or transacted. And First Climate transacted or delivered just over 10 million tons to our clients, supporting them, compensating just over 10 million tons of carbon in the voluntary market. So just over 10% market activity, connections to, well over 150 projects all throughout the world in emerging economies, helping projects that are reducing emissions or avoiding emissions from a bunch of different technologies, and certainly go into that a little bit later.
Yeah. So how does the carbon market relate to sort of mining companies? And how does mining companies sort of get involved?
So I guess one of the biggest things that, some of the, well, not only mining companies, but every sector and country has realized, in light of the impact of the recent IPCC report, International Panel Council on Climate Change, is the human impact on the climate that we have is undeniable, and business as usual from the past 40 years can't continue as it was. So there are clear targets to, electrify the economy. And so there's a need for more raw resources and mining activities to expand. But on the other hand, investors are now requiring additional ESG activities to be, bundled with that, maybe being carbon neutral in order to expand your mine or issue new permits. And there are a lot of stakeholders in the global economy that are stepping up their targets to the Paris Agreement, and ways that companies or corporates can support these emission reduction targets is through offsetting of unavoidable carbon emissions. That can't wait until 2030 or 2050. Needs to happen now. But as a company, maybe it's not the big Vale or BHP, but a company operating 1 or 2 mines, the easiest way to get involved. Quantify the carbon footprint of the company activities. There are a lot of tools out there. One of them might be the greenhouse gas protocol. Sets out some outlines, different stages of where carbon emissions occur and how you account for those. And then it's putting a price on that carbon, compensating for those emissions and supporting emission reduction projects.
So what is the size of the voluntary carbon market?
So to maybe put a bit of perspective, the size of the carbon market is dwarfed by the amount of emissions that are emitted, or greenhouse gas emissions that we produce. Companies, well, I guess for the how it happens, I guess there's about 40 billion tons of carbon that is emitted annually right now. In order to meet these Paris Agreement targets, and maybe we meet this 1.5 degrees or 2 degree scenario where global temperatures are not raising above that level, we need to have those emissions. So going from 40 billion down to 20 billion tons of carbon emitted by 2030. Now, the voluntary carbon market is much smaller than that. Last year, there was 100 million tons of carbon retired from the voluntary market. Now, there are some working groups that are trying to scale this up because they see the voluntary carbon market needs to be a part of this emission reduction activity over the next 10 and 20 years. And so it's there's plans to scale up, grow 10 to 15 times over the next 10 years in order to meet our global carbon reduction goals. But yeah, last year there was just over 100 million tons of carbon retired from various different types of emission reduction projects, whether that's forestry conservation, industrial energy efficiency, renewable electricity in emerging economies.
Yeah. Who's sort of engaged in the carbon market? And is there any particular countries that are giving off more carbon than they should do? Is there some countries that are worse than others, or even industries?
Mm-hmm. So well, I guess there's 2 types of carbon markets. One is voluntary and one is compliance. So in Europe, that's the biggest compliance carbon market, and there's regulations for certain industries that they're given certain allowances, and well, it's been all-time highs for these allowances, up to well over 60 euros, and then well, there's the voluntary carbon market, and so these can be supporting emission reduction projects internationally, and usually outside of, these projects are usually in locations where there are no current policies that supported that emission reduction activity. Now, in the past, from 2013 to 2020, a lot of emission reduction projects were from renewable electricity deployment in India or in China, as the business as usual activity was coal-fired electricity power generation. But then now, there's no need for the carbon market to kind of support those activities. Renewables are quite economic, and so now there's a bit of a shift. But those would be the 2 countries where there's a lot of carbon market supply, would be from India and China. And then I guess who else is engaged in the carbon market? It started off probably in the finance sector. They were like the banking, aviation. It was compensating for the emissions of business travel. More recently, since 2018, it's exploded in growth. There are now carbon neutral product lines, companies looking, carbon neutral transport, and kind of engaging all throughout the supply chain. One, I think, interesting use case or client case, I guess, for the mining sector, Apple, they use some of the raw materials in the mining sector, and they're looking to be carbon neutral by 2030. One example of how they're engaging with their clients right now, supplier code of conduct. If you're a semiconductor, you have to produce your products with 100% renewable electricity. And so in order to have a contract with Apple, you have to also show them you're consuming 100% renewable electricity in your factory. And I could see that coming down the line to the raw material producers and suppliers. For Apple to meet their 2030 targets, they're going to be engaging all the way down, and each company is going to have to be responsible for their emissions, and they would have to compensate those. So that's kind of how I see it relating a little bit to some of the mining clients, or to the mining sector, big or small. Maybe you don't have to be carbon neutral in your whole company level for next year, but starting off with certain product lines, or certain commodities, or things that are shipped to a certain region, I think it'll certainly be requested.
Yeah. So obviously some of these companies are relying on the primary resources, as you mentioned, and i.e. mining is a primary resource. So what examples are some of the mining companies? What are they doing in the carbon market at the moment?
Well, one thing, there's one kind of big overarching working group. It's called the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Markets, and so there's a lot of discussion about robustness of the voluntary carbon market, how it needs to scale up in order to, like we talked about, it's 100 million tons right now. It needs to get over 1 billion tons if it's going to have an impact on our global emission reduction activities. And so they're part of the working group. BHP Billiton, Vale, they're part of this, along with the energy majors, insurance companies, financial institutions, and they're looking to scale up the carbon market. And then another one, I think you had one example on your podcast here about a month ago. There's a mining company that is entirely compensating the emissions from their activities, and so that's the first one that I've seen. That's the first big splash from the mining sector. But the trend in carbon neutral commodities is growing. So right now, the big trend is in the energy majors delivering carbon neutral LNG, crude, and I think it's inevitable. I've heard from a couple clients where the transportation emissions are of transporting steel pipeline is also going to be required. So that's where I kind of see this whole thing going, and how the mining companies are slowly starting to have to be responsible for their emissions.
Yeah, you've mentioned a few different sets of figures there, and it looks like 2030 is the date that they want to reduce a lot of these carbon emissions. How realistic are these figures? And I suppose, relating it to mining, what do mining companies really need to do, and what do they need to focus if they're not already doing that? Is there certain companies that are focusing on certain areas to reduce their carbon output?
Yeah, there's well, every industry is engaged right now in setting these commitments, and action needs to follow through. But it seems that like that, and some of the things for decarbonizing at first starts with quantifying your carbon emissions. Where is energy efficiency and internal emission reductions possible? Then the next thing in the mining sector, it's already happening at speed, is electrification of vehicles. Of reducing the carbon footprint, instead of using, or what did I hear? One previous podcaster was talking about the use of hempcrete And then I've heard of other things in the concrete sector where, maybe using waste plastics for 5 or 10% of that to, reduce the overall carbon footprint of that product. So, assessing the building materials when constructing the mine. And another thing that I haven't heard too much about, there's a little bit of peer-reviewed research, and a colleague of mine in Canada, he's focused on this, is the reclamation activities, using waste biosolids as a way to, as it's an underutilized way to manage those municipal wastes, and then also build soil carbon stocks and support the biomass growth during the reclamation activities. So something that could and probably should be considered to decrease the greenhouse gas impact of a mine for the lifetime of it. And then finally, where these emission reduction strategies are not possible, there's always going to be some sort of residual emissions. It's compensating for unavoidable carbon emissions. So that's what the case example there of the carbon neutral nickel mine. They quantified their carbon emissions, and then they balance those out with, it can be a forestry conservation project that avoids deforestation, supports forestry conservation projects in Indonesia or Paraguay, places with high levels of permanent deforestation from shifting agriculture.
Do you think the mining companies in general are ahead of the curve with their carbon emissions, or do you think they're a little bit behind if they've got obviously these targets to hit? And if they are slightly behind, what should they be looking to do?
I have a feeling there's a lot of road to gain for the mining companies. I think it's all about the quantification and setting up a roadmap. The energy majors, they are certainly getting going and using the voluntary carbon market as ways to meet their net zero and carbon neutral targets. So mining companies, they should also be assessing this, the voluntary carbon market, as it's just a tool. It's there's all of it's one of 15 tools or whatever there are. It's not a silver bullet, but certainly one way to support global decarbonization targets.
Yeah, and how do you have a carbon neutral mine? What are some of the things, I suppose, if a company is looking to start a mine, which there's obviously a lot of projects out there, if they were looking to go sort of carbon neutral, what are some of the things that maybe not necessarily are too obvious that some of these companies should be focusing on?
So it's usually, it helps once you compensate for emissions that have been produced. So from the combustion of diesel on site or something like this. Then, so once the mine is active, or you also have your mine activity plan. What is the business as usual, and how can you reduce those activities or reduce greenhouse gas emissions from those activities? That was the electrification, maybe using alternative building materials, maybe extra activities of increasing increasing soil carbon on the site, or biomass or carbon from the biomass stocks on the site, and then finally compensating the emissions. And then, overall you have a balance of residual emissions versus, compensating with emissions that have been avoided somewhere else.
So I suppose across the whole mine site, every company should be looking at each individual area to see, and like you said, I think you said earlier on in the podcast, looking at every area and focusing on where they can actually reduce, and obviously think up of ways in which they can obviously reduce the emissions.
Yeah, certainly that's how it all starts out, from reducing where possible, and then compensating for the residual remaining emissions that are hard to abate.
Yeah. So what type of what type of carbon credits are actually available, and what are the prices for each of them?
And so it's quite well. There are a few different standards out there, how companies can engage in the carbon market. I think two of the leading ones would be Verra and the gold standard. So what type of credits are available, or like what is the technology? There's kind of two different pathways. Some projects, they avoid carbon and some remove carbon. So avoided carbon project, you take a baseline activity of coal-fired electricity generation, and then the implemented activity carbon reduction or avoided carbon project would be installing a wind installation or solar PV farm that generates electricity and avoids the demand from that coal-fired electricity power plant. So that's an avoided carbon project, and those still need financing. That can also be from improving landfill waste management so that there's no methane leaks from these poorly managed landfill sites. Then the other could be, or the other stream or direction methodology is carbon removal projects, and these are either technical or natural. So technical would be this direct air capture and storage, but in the voluntary carbon market, the only projects around under the gold standard in VCS are afforestation, where the biomass grows, carbon is removed from the atmosphere, and so these are seen as a carbon removal project. And you were asking about pricing.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
That's depends on the technology. I guess depends on the location. Economic projects can be under $5 per ton, and then some of the nature-based projects, certainly they demand a bit higher, 8 to 10 or even up to $20 a ton for afforestation activities, and depends on the scale of the project, whether that's afforesting 5,000 hectares or if it's conserving forest stocks over 50,000 hectares or 1 million hectares. And then I think I just also wanted to add on this note about the technical carbon removals is they get a lot of attention right now. We even have some clients that are requesting they're only going to compensate for their emissions that are from technical carbon removals. But to put in perspective, there's a good report that came out at the start of the year from JP Morgan 2021 Energy Outlook. And I just wanted to look at my notes here. It was in order to technically sequester 15% of the US greenhouse gas emissions, we would require infrastructure or pipeline capacity that's currently higher than the existing pipelines for distributing and refining oil in the USA. So this current infrastructure for distributing existing or distributing oil and gas in the USA, this took over 100 years to deploy. And we're not at too high of levels here for the technical carbon removal infrastructure. And so for that, it will play a part, but it's also not the silver bullet that some of these energy majors are talking about if they're only going to use the technical carbon removals. I mean, voluntary carbon market can also, conserve forests, and I think conserving existing natural carbon stocks, should not be discarded.
Yeah. How do you define quality in a verified carbon project?
Oh yeah. Well, there's no need to start at zero. There's been a lot of work that's already been done in this. A couple of the leading standards, Verra, they are headquartered in Washington, DC, and Gold Standard, they're headquartered in Switzerland. They've been developing methodologies and really trying to improve, what these baseline assessments are from business as usual to the project is implemented and how many tons of carbon does it avoid or sequester. They've done a lot of work to improve that those baseline standards. since 2013, or they've been around even a bit longer, but there's been a lot of development since that time. And so I think choosing a project from one of those two standards is the good first start. They both have different attributes. The gold standard, it quantifies carbon emission reductions from a project, but also at the same time, it also quantifies the benefits or attributions of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that go along with that implementation of that project. And then whether that's providing clean drinking water, gender equality, education that go along with maybe one of those implemented household energy efficiency projects. Then Verra, they have something where they quantify the carbon under a VCS standard, verified carbon standard, and then the additional benefits of that through another standard called CCB, Climate, Community, and Biodiversity. And so some projects, often these nature-based projects that are forestry conservation, some people might know them as REDD+, reducing emissions from degradation and deforestation, plus community benefits. These projects, they have VCS plus CCB, so it means they conserve carbon, conserve the natural carbon stocks, and also support climate, community biodiversity benefits. If it's in at-risk regions or there are endemic species there, working with the communities in the ground to ensure there are alternative livelihood project activities that avoid deforestation. So working with these standards, I think is definitely one of the the first things to be doing. And then along with that, these projects, they're all third-party verified. So it's not First Climate that's you don't have to trust us. I mean, we also do our due diligence in these projects, but the methodology written by experts at the standard, and then a third-party auditor goes in, and if it's about a forestry conservation project, they're doing satellite imagery assessment and then ground truthing, making sure to assess what's the deforestation rate over the past 5 years or 10 years in this region, and what has happened this current year or this past current year in 2020. Has there been any deforestation? No, they verify that. And then these are reports that are publicly available in the registry for companies that are looking to engage and compensate their emissions. You can certainly read these. So that would be the first steps to kind of define quality, and you can kind of go from there. A lot of other ones, some companies, they also like to focus on countries where they're operating, or maybe if where their raw materials go to might be some other things to consider when choosing a carbon project.
Yeah, with obviously depending on what country you're in, is there some sort of government initiatives to help companies? And I suppose, look, we're obviously working in the mining industry. Is there sort of government incentives at all to help companies assist in obviously reducing carbon?
So the thing about the carbon markets is that it needs to be additional. The project needs to be, the implementation of that project needs to go above and beyond or outside the scope of the current policies in that country. So that's why there are no carbon reduction projects for renewable electricity in Europe. And the standards are also developing all the time. And they've also said that there's no, they will not be issuing new, or they will not be registering new renewable electricity projects in China or in India because there are government policies there past 2020, right? So often, but then there are some at-risk countries, of deforestation. I mean, there are some projects, forestry conservation projects. I think off the top of my head, I think I know like the in Cambodia, for example, where there's opportunity where maybe the project developer is a government entity, and they would still be, issuing carbon credits from that project, and that's how a company can, support the forestry conservation in a country like that.
Okay. We've got a viewer question. We advertised probably last week that you were going to come on the show, and we asked if anyone wanted to ask you a question. And we've got a question from Owen McCall, who asks, what is the process like to get a project certified as a carbon offset or carbon credit provider?
That's a bit of a timely process, and I guess it usually depends on the technology. There are a few things that have to go along. You have to write a project description. You have to have that approved by the methodology, whether that's gold standard or Vera. Is it a tree planting project? Is it a forestry conservation project? If you're a mine, is it adding biosolids onto your landscape to improve or increase the soil carbon stocks? You need to work on the methodologies, or work with the methodologies there, write those up. Then the project can be implemented, and then there's a bit of approval. I think this kind of takes about 2 years, maybe, before the then there's an auditor that goes in, like the third-party auditor that we were talking about. They have to assess that the activities have taken place, and this can usually take, quick would be 24 months, I think. Okay,
so quite a cumbrous process then to go through. If obviously companies are looking to I suppose reduce their carbon in certain areas of their business.
Yeah, and they also require, depends on the methodology, like for landscape management projects, whether this is like the soil management, tree afforestation, forestry conservation. These projects require 20-year land management activities, so it's required. You should be in for the long haul if you're looking to develop your own project. But there are existing ones out there. Not every company needs to develop their own project. You can also focus on your core business of mining, and then there are other project developers that are like First Climate are 100% core businesses, carbon market. So there are existing projects out there where you can they have issued carbon credits from their forestry conservation activities, and you can buy those and support and provide climate finance to continuing the success of those.
Yeah. So as a conclusion, I just wondered if you can give us an overview of First Climate and how you can potentially help mining companies if they're looking to obviously reduce their carbon emissions in certain areas of their business. I wonder if you can just tell us some of the services that you're able to provide, and maybe consultancy services that you can help these mining companies with.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the consulting services are kind of how it usually works. What our clients are doing, it's and how we engage with them, helping quantify the carbon emissions that are taking place using the greenhouse gas protocol. Then, every company, they're focused on whatever activities for reducing their emissions, and then in the end, maybe they want to be carbon neutral, or they want to deliver a carbon neutral product to a client. And this is where we can, or maybe they have a target to be carbon neutral by 2030. Here we can assess the entire corporate carbon footprint, how a stepwise approach, how you can compensate your carbon emissions starting in 2021 from projects that are on the market, maybe implementing your own projects at the same time, so that in 5 or 6 years the majority of your carbon portfolio is coming from projects that you've developed. These are some of the services that we are certainly helping our clients out with.
Yeah, and I suppose you can help not just obviously the big companies that have multiple mine sites, but also mining companies that are maybe going into construction, or even in the pre-feasibility stages of projects. So I suppose you can help companies throughout the whole project life cycle.
Certainly. I mean, we've also been engaged some early discussions with some energy companies that are looking to be, exporting gas from a facility, by the year, 2022, 2023, and they're looking to have a carbon strategy, and they don't want to be, buying carbon credits or emission reduction credits from the spot market in 2023, and so we can work with them now, build a portfolio. So even if it's in the planning stages, to have a carbon neutral mine by 2023, would love to have a chat. Certainly help you out.
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, appreciate your time, Matt. Wondered if you can wondered if you're on any social media platforms, and how can our audience reach out to you if they've got any questions, which I imagine they have got some questions, are obviously around carbon emissions. How can they go about contacting you?
Yeah, I guess the company contact would be the best. I can provide this for the show notes here. Email Matthew Laustrup at firstclimate.com, and then also on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Like I said, we'll include these in the show notes accompanying this. So if you want to reach out to Matt, if you've got any questions, then yeah, please do so. Matt, really appreciate your time for giving us an overview, and I suppose learning around obviously carbon emissions. And obviously I'd imagine a lot of mining companies, if they're not already doing it, are thinking about reducing their carbon output. And you've obviously, hopefully you've given some of our audience some ideas as to what they need to start doing. And if they're facing any challenges, they can obviously reach out to you. So really appreciate your time. And those that are listening, thank you for listening to obviously this episode. Appreciate if you can pass this on to definitely some of your colleagues in the industry, because I'd imagine if you're having some of your challenges around this, they will be also. So appreciate if you can obviously share this episode amongst your colleagues, former colleagues in the industry, so they've got the chance to understand more about the carbon market. So thank you again, Matt. Appreciate your time.
Happy to be here.
No, and appreciate your time. And until next time, happy mining.